Welcome to See Beneath Your Beautiful, where guests share stories of adversity and perseverance, which inspire, encourage, and challenge us. We embrace these tough conversations, intimately exploring our loves, fears, and hopes with a delicious combination of depth and lightness.
Hey y'all, I'm Andrew Lang. I am a workshop leader and an educator in the Pacific Northwest in the United States. I've been a high school teacher for the past 7 years. And in terms of workshops, I mostly guide adults through processing their inner lives, their stories, the hopes and dreams they had for their life. And what do you do when those maybe don't turn out how you expected? I'm the author of Unmasking the Inner Critic, Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. And I am so happy to be here and excited for a great conversation.
How do you know how to do all that? Did you go through something yourself?
Well, I went through many things. I started this on a whim about 10 years ago now. And I had a feeling that there was something deeper than what I was handed when it came to understanding who I am in the world. Mm-hmm. And so the whim was that I basically got a group together and I said, hey, do you want to sit and meditate for a bit and then talk about what emerges? Mm-hmm. And from that space, we did that for about 3 years. And from that space, what came up again and again and again were these deep yearnings, I would say. And I think I certainly still feel them. And I think other people that I talk to do as well, these yearnings to tap into something deeper inside of ourselves. And I usually refer to it as our inherent dignity, the parts of ourselves that are so often removed by everything else in society. So I learned to hold this space very much through processing my own stuff with others.
When I was a single mom with 2 young kids and just making it, and then they grow up and then you think there's something more. Is that what we're talking about? Like when you're not just getting through the day, when you have the ability to dig deeper?
Yeah. And I think some people experience it as an itch. You know, there's just something more. Maybe I don't have the tools to get to it, or maybe there's trauma there. And so I don't have the resiliency, the emotional bandwidth to go there. I think a lot of the parents I know are in that boat where there's too much. There's not enough time. But I also think that we aren't handed a lot of the tools to do the inner excavation, the inner unpacking.
Yeah.
I'll share a story of mine. This was a big moment for me. A few years ago, I was engaged and first I'll say I grew up and I was really taught to be an agent of like change and justice in the world. I grew up going to protests. I grew up really politically engaged. And when I became a teacher, I carried that energy of it's mine to do, it's mine to fix into the classroom. And that brought with it some good things. I think I'm still proud of the curriculum I created. And it was centered around, what do students really want to engage with? What in their stories can we bring up and bring out in this space? But it also brought with it some really problematic stuff. I came in like a savior. And so with all of that, what happened a couple of years ago is that I was engaged to a person. And at the same time as we were, lining things up for the wedding, a new principal came into our school and the principal and I didn't see eye to eye. And so all of my fix it, save it, solve it energy, it was like a holy war every time I was at work. Our bodies hold our tension.
Right.
And so I would drive home and I would just be boiling, angry, mad, but I didn't quite know what to fully do with it. I had some tools, but not nearly enough at that point. And so I would get home and none of that had been resolved or worked through in the 20-minute drive. And so my partner became another space. The space with my partner became another space for a lot of that anger and that energy to be with us. And it created a home life that felt like there were landmines everywhere. Don't say the wrong thing. Don't do the wrong thing. And I remember one night we're sitting on our couch and we were having an argument and neither of us were loud arguers. We were very calm and listening to each other, but it was an argument. And all that anger and frustration that was in me from work and this disintegration of a relationship that I thought had been so stable started boiling up. And I jumped up and I said, I gotta go. My body needs to go right now. And so I left the house and I got on my bicycle and I just powered up the block full speed. and, pushing. And I'm not a bicyclist. So it was not pretty. And I ended up in this neighborhood. I had no idea where I was. There was no street lights, but my body said, all right, you're done now. You have no biking stamina. So we're going to stop. And so I came to an end on the street that I didn't know in the pitch black. And all I had was my breath. All I had was this sheer exhaustion of pushing and angering at the world. And as I was breathing, I realized, oh, this is what it feels like to be in an unknown space, an unfamiliar space, a thin place, if you will. And what emerged in me from that experience was so much, one, grace for myself, saying it's okay to feel the feelings that you're experiencing, but also what came from the deep space of pain and sorrow was a new look at the beauty of life. Mm-hmm. And how do we, in the midst of the muck, still see and experience and honor the beauty in ourselves and in each other? And that really has further infused the kind of work I do with other adults, is how do we say yes to the stuff that we're going through that is real and painful and harmful and often connected to trauma, while also not losing sight of the beauty that comes in the human experience. It sucks. It's not easy.
Yeah.
That was a big turning point for me from I'm going to sit in meditation and think I'm solving myself to it's not about solving anymore. It's about sitting and honoring and seeing and learning to experience the world with soft eyes.
You just read my letter from the editor of my first issue of the magazine, because that's exactly what I'm hoping the world gets, is that there's beauty in all of it, in all of us, no matter what we look like, what we know, what we don't know, whatever talents we possess, whatever we've gone through, there's beauty.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question then? Because I'm curious. For me, what I have found is that the beauty is always there. It's so often the narratives that we've been handed that block us from seeing. Have you experienced that too?
I lost my mother when I was 18, and I can live in that story that I'm motherless. My life sucks. She wasn't there for raising my children. But on the other hand, losing my mother at a young age made me appreciate life. I really pay attention to the sunrises and the sunsets. She died at 46 and I'm going to be 55 soon, and every day is a blessing. So there's beauty in that. I think the contrasts of the hard things help us see the beauty in everything else. Is that what you think?
Yeah. Mary Oliver has this phrase that I always just kind of have popping around in my head. She refers to the very drab, the beauty in the common, the ordinary, the very drab. Mm-hmm. And every once in a while, when I start going on autopilot, I have to remind myself, look for the beauty in the very drab, look for the beauty in the heartache. Yeah. But also look for the beauty in the squirrel that's doing some random squirrel things.
I volunteer for an organization that takes pictures of people in life-threatening diagnoses. So I have taken pictures of a mother holding her stillborn baby and another about to take her 2-week-old off life support. And then just recently, a 17-year-old who has life-threatening leukemia. But those hard images in my head, those images that stick with me, really make me drive home from those things going, oh my gosh, look at the sky, how beautiful it is. And I just appreciate everything. I think viewing all of life and not living in a little bubble helps you really appreciate all the beauty of it.
Yeah. There's a phrase called spiritual bypassing that I think is really valuable. And that's not what we're talking about. Spiritual bypassing is essentially when you look at something that's hard and you find a pithy little statement to get past it. And that's not what we're talking about. There's a subtle depth, I feel, when you go into the heartache and into the pain. I think of you taking these pictures, right? Mm-hmm. When you are in this space, or I think about the people who've given their consent for you to take these pictures, right? There's a subtlety and a depth dimension of being in that moment that is so extraordinarily painful, and recognizing that there's still inherent dignity in this moment and in each of these people. For me, there's a connection here also with thinking about homelessness and thinking about the housing insecurity that's experienced in so many major cities right now. We, as a society, I feel, haven't been largely given the tools to sit with the pain and sit with the shadows of a
Right.
society that creates homelessness, right? Structurally. And so we don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what I hope to do with the people who are around me is invite folks and tool people up for how do you engage these really hard issues and these hard spaces, these thin places, and homelessness as an example. How do you engage in a way that at the very basic level, you're seeing a person eye to eye? Because from there, worlds open. From there, things become possible.
I would like to know what some tools you share with people are.
I'll offer a framework and then a tool that I use. The framework isn't mine. I actually have no idea where I picked it up. It may have been Viktor Frankl, but
Okay.
the idea is that no matter what life occurs, that's a truth.
Right.
And so we can't control or stop bad things from occurring, from pain from happening. That's part of the life. And so what he says is that, no matter what, there's going to be a stimulus. Something's going to happen. And if we are running on autopilot, what it usually looks like is we react. So the stimulus happens, there's a reaction. And maybe if we're lucky, we get to reflect later and think, that wasn't a great reaction, or I could have done that differently. There's another way, and this is what meditation has helped me with, but there's many other things that can do this. The stimulus is still going to happen. And instead of a reaction, if you have a practice that can help you create space between the stimulus and your response.
Mm-hmm.
And so learning to see the thing like, oh, okay, that's happening, and pause enough to get your critical thinking brain and your body, right? Our bodies hold knowledge and that tension so that your body and your brain can come with a response that is appropriate and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
That changes the game. So here's a tool that I use personally that helps me open up that middle space. It's a phrase. And the phrase goes like this: it is what it is. And how can I be present with it in a loving way? It is what it is means that we begin by recognizing without judgment what's happening, whether that's outside of us or inside of us. When my anger flares up, it is what it is. I'm feeling anger. Or when I see the person on the street who is suffering in pain or hurting someone, begin with, it is what it is. Not to shrug it off, but to name that this is a thing that's happening. Okay. And the next step is, it is what it is. And how can I be present with it in a loving way? So the second part of this, how can I be present fully here, not shrug it off, not go somewhere else, not ignore? How can I be present with my emotion, my anger that just flared? How can I be present in this moment with that thing that's happening outside of me? And then how can I be present in a loving way?
Mm-hmm.
How can I show up for that person who is being harmed right now in a loving way, not necessarily a savior way, not necessarily a I'm going to fix this problem for you way. What it really asks us to figure out what love means for us. But how can I be present with this person in a loving way? Or with myself, if that anger is flowing, right? How can I be present with the part of me that is angry in a loving way? It opens up that middle space so that we can think, all right, what's a loving response here? Not flippantly. What does love look like in this moment coming from the uniqueness that I am in this space?
Do you know who Byron Katie is? She has this story where she was held up at gunpoint, and instead of being scared, she was present and going, oh, what's this going to be like? What's going to happen? She's like, I didn't want to miss the last moments of my life if that was going to be the last moments of my life.
Oh, wow.
It reminds me of what you're saying. She was with herself in this situation very lovingly, knowing this is what was happening and not trying to shy away from it. I want at the end of my life to be present to those last few moments and not shy away and be scared and be worried about them.
What I immediately thought of in that moment was, right when you said that, was the ways that we just run on autopilot, not being present in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
One thought that popped up in me, and I noticed, and that's so much of this work is just like noticing the narratives that pop up, right? Noticing the things. The more you're present to the moment, the more you have healthy response.
Exactly.
We have that fight, flight, freeze, right? We get to choose what we do. Viktor Frankl, and this is the part that is him. I remember this part. Between the stimulus and the response, he says, in that spaciousness in between lies our freedom.
I just finished this book called the beauty of what remains. It's so beautiful, and it's about death. And one of the lines that stood out to me, or one of the passages, was that to make meaning of that death, this man's son had died. And even though it was unfair and felt cruel, to then go and make meaning somehow for your life of what happened to you, and that the birth of his son was the most significant, and also the death of his son was the most significant. And now do something with that.
There's stages. We talk about stages of grief, right? There's stages of it's okay to sit in it. It's actually vital to sit in it, to take pictures of the people who are in such pain as you were speaking of earlier. And then to be able to start processing out. And that's where I am a huge proponent of therapy. I think therapists are unbelievably important in that process. And I also think introspection. So often these points of pain become moments or wake up moments for us to take an inventory of our own stuff.
Right.
Not just what have we done and what do we still want to do, but an inventory of what are the things I was handed about this that didn't turn out right, that didn't seem to work. In my family, we have 2 kids. One is 3 and one is 4 right now. And I think about the process of them growing up, and I have all these narratives around, you're going to go to college, and all these narratives around, you're going to do this and that, and the world's going to be your oyster, and I'm going to die first. Mm-hmm. And all of these things, they'll get married, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is those are my narratives that I was handed. None of those might end up being true. And so when these pain points happen, it is an invitation and a flag for us to look at our own narratives and think about, what was I handed and why did I think that was a capital T truth?
Right.
Because it's not. And that in itself is also an invitation to how can I be in the present moment, seeing the world through what is rather than seeing the world through my narrative of what the world should be.
What you want it to be. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I always say I wear rose-colored glasses, but I'm also seeing it for what it is. I just see the beauty, even through the stuff that is hard to look at, I think is also beautiful.
One of my teachers, his name is James Finley. He's a psychotherapist and he was a monk for a bunch of years. And he refers to the part of ourself that is underneath all the things that we pack on top of it, all the things that our culture packs on top of it. And he says there's a part of ourselves in our very depth that is infinitely precious. And he also refers to it as invincible. And it was really hard for me to get that second part for a long time. And I think I'm still processing, what does it mean to have a part of me that's invincible when the world can be so rough and tumble? Mm-hmm. I trust him. And so I trust that there is a part of us that is infinitely precious and invincible underneath the parts of us that are going to experience the world and all the pains.
Right.
That's the part of us that's beauty. That's beauty, seeing beauty in the world.
That's very lovely. But don't you think we're invincible because we're still standing? We have had pain and we've survived it.
There's resiliency.
Do you coach people or do you have online classes? How does this work? How do you help people?
For a bunch of years, I have done workshop model. I really like working with groups. I love having people in a room and holding space. Mm-hmm. I love helping people identify the narratives they're walking in with and then start to question those narratives that are maybe holding them back from really becoming in touch with that part of them that's infinitely precious, right? Largely, it is in groups. I love doing guided journaling. So every month or two, I just host a free guided journaling event where people hop on Zoom and I have a reading or two from one of my wisdom teachers. Mary Oliver was one of them a couple months ago. And I come with prompts. It's totally the high school teacher in me. I come with some prompts, some questions, and we just sit together and we journal. My true belief, and this comes from community development work, but my true belief is that questions are more important than answers.
Right.
And so if there's any space where I can introduce a question that can really mess with you for the next week, right? That can continue on with you and ask you something deeper that can't be resolved, that really asks you to sit with it. I feel like I've done my work for the moment. I can't say enough about the value and the power of holding space with others, not as the professional or the expert in the room, but as a person who's also doing the exact same work.
So I think the answer is to question everything, right? Recently, this happened. Somebody I asked to be on the podcast that I sort of know, and he didn't get back to me. And I was thinking, he was thinking, well, I'm too good for that podcast. And he came back a couple months later saying, I didn't think I had anything of value for your podcast. Like I wasn't good enough for your podcast. I have to keep reminding myself to question everything. What do I know? I just totally assumed one thing and it was totally wrong. I love that.
The learning to sit in the unknown and saying, you know what, that person's walking their path too. I'm walking mine. I just got back from walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain.
Oh, cool.
100 miles of walking. And one of the things I found on that trail, which is powerful, is that you start and you see people. And you might even speak to a couple folks as you're walking, 10, 15 miles a day. And then 2 or 3 days later, you realize you haven't seen them for 2 or 3 days. And they pop up again a week later, or they don't. And you're left with this realization that that moment we had was enough. And I don't actually need to cling to that person or my memory of that person. They're on their own path. Literally, they are walking their own pace. And I think that was such a lesson that I'm still unpacking as I come back from that experience is in our day to day, how do we learn to not cling to others and simply rest in that unknowingness?
Yes. I had this image the other day of young Hara, and in an embarrassing moment, because most of the, memories are because you're young and dumb, but it wasn't painful to look. And it was as if I had put on movie glasses and I was watching the movie of young Hara, but I didn't have the pain anymore. It was just, I was watching a movie and it was okay. And it was interesting. I was inside of me, but I wasn't feeling the tension that came with that instance. So that was really kind of cool.
Yeah. There's a inverse experience of that where if we can know that that moment is going to come at some point for us. So we're going through the pain right now, but I know that at some point I'll be able to look back and I won't feel the pain I feel right now.
Oh, yeah.
I call that the power of and. If we have the capacity to sit in the pain and know that it's not forever.
Right.
It doesn't stop the pain from happening right now. It doesn't take us out of the moment, but there's a healthy perspective there that allows us to sustain.
I think that's another blessing of my mom passing away young, that I see all these people who are losing their parents and they're in so much pain. And I already know that they're going to be okay because I am. It is hard and it stays hard, but you're always okay in every moment if we can just be present to the moment.
It's really difficult. And I think some people can hear that and some people, 12-year-old Andy would not have been able to hear that.
For sure. Told a girlfriend that she was always okay. And she said, well, no, I was in a car accident and it was scary.
Yeah.
But here you are. So even though you were scared in the moment, you were okay. You survived. Everything's okay now. You didn't believe it then. And you're playing the story in your mind as if you're still going through that car accident, but it's years later and you're okay. We can get through it. Whatever's happening to us, no matter how bad it is, we are invincible.
Yeah. There's a phrase that just popped up in my mind, and it has everything to do with when we're going through that pain, when we're in that space, the power it is to have a community of trust around you. And it doesn't need to be more than 2 people, someone that you can connect with who will simply listen. We'll say, yeah, that sucks. That thing you're going through is awful. I mean, I remember to the end of that relationship, but I also have other moments in my life where there's been pretty rough pain. And I think about the folks around me who had the capacity to just sit and listen with me. And then I think of the other folks who wanted to bypass, maybe they weren't able to sit with the unknown or sit with the pain. They would fling some little phrase to get out, to move the conversation along. There's so much goodness and power to being that person for your friend or being that person for your coworker who's willing to just, I'm going to stop everything I'm doing because you and your pain right now needs witnessing and needs someone to honor that it's real for you. And that's something I can do right now. You asked about tools earlier. There's it is what it is tool. I also think a tool is just listening and honoring. If we could do that more. I
have now become known as the person who can hold space for people. And I have strangers, not kidding, messaging me with all their hard stories. And it's hard.
Yeah.
I'm listening and I'm acknowledging and seeing them. But also I don't know what to do for myself. As the person who's holding space, what's that look like? It's a little bit of a burden, and I don't know how to just be that person.
This is why I couldn't be a therapist. My partner and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. And one of the reasons I couldn't be a therapist is that hearing that much, especially when it's mixed with money, right? But hearing that much and then having to hold that, I know is too much a weight for me at this moment in my life.
Well, me too. I'm not a therapist.
Yeah,
I didn't
right?
sign up for this. I don't know.
For me, when I have experienced that, because I call it emotional burnout.
Okay. Yeah.
I go on real long walks.
Oh, that's a really good idea.
It's body movement. And so dopamine in your mind starts firing. That's really helpful for me. For me, trees call to me. There's just something about when you're out in nature and you're walking along and there is a tree that's just epic.
Mm-hmm.
Trees have a communication pattern. They release chemicals into the ground to tell other trees when this beetle just started, scraping my bark off. Just so you know, these beetles are in the neighborhood. And I think about stuff like that. Here I am with all of this story that just got placed on me that I was honored to honor. And I still need to go. I need to set a boundary. And I think about your emails with that, right? Like, how do we set boundaries around, I'm going to hear this much of your story, and thank you for sharing. Here are some resources.
That's a great idea. Oh, I should have resources.
One of my greatest resources, almost every workshop I've done in the last probably 3 or 4 years, I provide a link to, I think it's Psychology Today, has a searchable list of therapists.
Oh, that's really smart.
I'm really overt with, I am not a therapist.
I just like having hard conversations. So people see that in me. But yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's okay. I'm happy when anybody on my podcast as an answer says to seek a therapist, because there's no shame in it. And it has provided so much freedom to just know myself better.
Yeah.
So thank you for promoting that.
There's different roles that we each have in this global community, especially in a circle of trust, or especially, in our neighborhoods. There's different roles that we each can play for each other. And I'm happy to play the role of I will listen and honor and bake you some banana bread if you really need it. And here's a link to find some therapists, and I will help you with that.
Sound advice. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. They're not asking anything from me, really, except to be heard. So
your question earlier of how did I get into this and what does this look like? So much of it came from, again and again, I listened and heard folks who were usually 50 and older saying that they had these stories, these things that had gone on in their life. And it was almost like they were aching to get out, someone to hear this. And I think that's one of the great pains of social isolation. I think that's also one of the great pains of institutions that we used to trust to help us create community and find depth. A lot of the institutions are dying. And so we have a lot of folks with a lot of stories and hurt, and they don't know, especially 50 and older, where I think the stigma around therapy is, you don't go unless you're broken. I think there's a lot of folks that need to hear that, no, therapy is great. Please, please go.
Right.
And also find someone in your group, in your friendships that can honor you.
Also, what do you say to somebody? I've heard this a number of times now, and they say, oh, I've been to a therapist once and I didn't like it.
Right before I went to the Camino in Spain, I've had some knee issues for the last couple of years. And I told my partner, no, I'm not going to go see a physical therapist. I went and they don't do anything. It's a waste of money. Well, then I realized it's going to be a serious problem if I'm out on the trail with no smartphone and nothing, and my knees go. And so I went to see a physical therapist for 12 weeks, entirely changed everything for me. And so I would share that story as an example of not all therapists are equal, and not all therapists are going to be the person for you in the moment that you are currently in. I've had multiple therapists. The one I had during the relationship breakup helped me sustain and grow in that space. And I also knew when it was time to say, all right, thank you for everything you've done. I'm ready to go in a new direction. There's value in just knowing, like, some therapists are going to really connect. Some aren't. So if you've had one that's not been great, try again. The other one I've experienced is, and don't only go once. If you have a therapist and you end the first visit going, I didn't really experience the total personal transformation I was hoping for, give a couple sessions. The test run for me is always 2 to 3 sessions to see if the relationship can be built there.
That's very good.
When I was young, I had a lot of body issues, perception of body issues. I felt fat. I felt like I was, the husky kid. And so I internalized this narrative of, I essentially became, I am my trauma. I am the fat kid that everyone sees.
Right.
And when I went into college, I found a group of guys that were my age, and they all had the same story. They all grew up and they felt fat and they were referred to as fat. And we all had this shared story of sneaking around the house with full bags of Lay's potato chips, trying to make sure our parents didn't hear. And when I met them, we informally started referring to ourselves as the Former Fat Kids Club. And there was a moment there where I went from being the victim that completely identified with my trauma to a different form of victim that still identified with my trauma. And then the next step that really came was stepping beyond that group and saying, actually, I don't need to identify with that trauma anymore. I did experience this. I was a survivor of this trauma, and I am more than that. And I think that's so much of the victim question is, how do we fully recognize the pain that we've gone through, identify with it, be able to say it is part of me, and that I can move beyond that because it's part of me and it is not me.
I am a person who has no mother, but I'm no longer only that. I'm not just a motherless daughter. So years ago, I heard, you have fat, but you're not fat. And I just really couldn't hear the difference. And I thought, how am I not fat? I'm fat. And then I heard a friend say she did a bad thing, but she's not bad. And it clicked for me. If I say I'm fat, it's like saying I'm arms because I have arms, or I'm hair because I have hair.
Yeah.
Everything's in your mind, and your freedom, as you're saying, is just looking at it in a new way and seeing the beauty.
And we're not defined by our labels. I think that's so much of it, right? All of my work in groups also has a social component because I think personal change and personal transformation, personal healing doesn't matter unless it impacts the way you walk in your community, right? So there's this social aspect. In the activist world right now, there's a big push to shift our language from saying homeless people to people who are experiencing houselessness or homelessness.
Right.
And it's exactly what you're saying is anytime you notice that you're labeling something that is actually a characteristic of a behavior or an action, not an identity, I think it's really important. You said earlier, question everything. That's worth questioning.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of See Beneath Your Beautiful, hosted by Hara Allison. And thanks for your ratings and reviews. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Stay tuned.